Good evening and welcome everyone to the Monday, April 11th, 2022 Plan Commission and Commission for Citizen Involvement meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order now. Iris, would you please call the roll?
Buchanan,
Here.
Heap,
Here.
Leak. Here. Pepe is excused. Phillips.
Here.
Rigby.
Here.
Stewart.
Here.
Well, thank you. We have a quorum. So next on our agenda is a council update. Unfortunately, Councilor Mann's indicated that she's tied up in another meeting tonight. And we'll be watching, but will not be able to join. She'll watch after the meeting's recorded. So we'll move on to public comment, item number 4 on our agenda. This is regarding issues not on the agenda. It's an opportunity to raise issues regarding planning. A time limit of 3 minutes per individual applies. Iris, was there anyone who wished to make public comment tonight?
Yes. Let me bring him in. He's participating by remote. His name is Benjamin Hendricks.
Good evening, Mr. Hendricks. If you'd like to go ahead and present your public comment, you may do so. A time limit of 3 minutes per individual does apply. Mr. Hendricks, if you're speaking, you may be on mute. We cannot hear you. So we'll just wait here a second until we can get confirmation of audio from Mr. Hendricks.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Sorry about that. I'm not used to Zoom. Are you able to see my presentation right now?
Oh, yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for your time. I'll try to speed it up since I caused a delay there. So Country Club Road, or I'll call it CCR, isn't just a throughway. It's the home address of almost 50 houses along the stretch from Iron Mountain Boulevard to Boone's Ferry Road. And while there are traffic controls on the western end of this stretch near the schools, there's a 1.3 mile stretch between Iron Mountain and Wembley Park that has 0 traffic stops. That's plenty of space for drivers to build up to a high speed. There's a record of serious high-speed wrecks and incidents here, and just yesterday we witnessed a lost dog get killed in front of our house by a speeding car. This unimpeded throughway encourages non-local freight traffic, which then clogs up downtown Lake Oswego. Few CCR drivers respect the posted speed limit of 40 miles per hour, but even if they did, a busy 5-lane wide road makes pedestrian crossing extremely dangerous or impossible. And with sidewalks only on the north side of the road for much of this stretch, it means residents who live on the south side cannot safely walk from their homes to explore LO. For those not in this situation, just imagine needing to get in your car to go for a walk. The school bus stops right on CCR, which means that kids are in particular danger. It's not uncommon to see cars fail to stop for these buses, as the road is so wide and traffic so fast that it sometimes doesn't occur to drivers that they're meant to stop. What's our solution? We propose some reasonable, low-cost actions that will immediately reduce these dangers. First, lower the speed limit on CCR to 35 miles per hour. This will make the transition to the nearby 20 mile per hour school zone less of a brake slamming affair, and will make enforcing reasonable traffic speeds even more actionable for our police department. Next, convert the intersection at Southwest Redwood Court and Bridge Court into a 4-way stop. This will discourage drivers from ramping up to high speeds on that length by reducing the longest unimpeded stretch to only 0.6 miles. It will also make the nearly blind left turn from Goodall onto eastbound CCR safer. Lastly, at that four-way stop, we would install a pedestrian button-triggered crossing with flashing lights along the ground when activated. These lights are common in some other cities and are extremely effective as drivers can't miss them along the sea of other signs and signals, especially at night. We've all seen how much small changes like this can improve our quality of life.
30 seconds.
Thank you. It would mean just a few changes and additions, some paint on the road, and some flashing lights on the asphalt. Please consider residents who live directly on CCR, as well as our citizens, drivers, joggers, bicyclists, walkers, and pets who spend time on or near CCR. Let's take some small but significant steps to help keep this safe, beautiful, sleepy town the way it is. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hendricks. I think some of the issues that you've raised here tonight are outside of the scope of the Plan Commission, but we'd be happy to refer those over to staff and to council to follow up. So thank you for presenting that tonight.
Thanks.
Excuse me, Commissioner Leek. You wish? Yeah, we'll work with staff and the engineering, the appropriate staff departments to have them look into the issue that Mr. Hendricks has raised. Thank you. Iris, was there anyone else who wished to make public comment tonight?
Yes, there's one more, Greg Aarons, and I'll move him over.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Good evening, Mr. Aarons. Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed with your public comment tonight. And
Okay,
just a reminder, a time limit of 3 minutes per individual applies.
Right. So this is pretty much the same issue that Mr. Hendricks raised. And I can either hold off if we're going to refer it, or I can take my 3 minutes.
Mr. Aarons, if you'd like to summarize, that's fine. Well, we will refer it over to the appropriate department, but it is slightly outside of the scope of the Plan Commission, but happy to hear any summary comments or things that you may want to add.
Yeah, so, as Mr. Hendricks mentioned, in addition to the junior and senior high schools, there are 3 churches and a synagogue. In addition to those homes that he mentioned, there are 52 additional homes on streets that just exit onto Country Club Road that don't go through anywhere else. And so there's a lot of in and out access. It is extremely dangerous for walkers, runners, and cyclists, of which I am all of those, to cross Country Club Road at any time, day or night. This includes children, adults, and seniors like myself who regularly cross, and we cross 3 to 4 times a day with our dog, and often have to stop in that middle lane because we can't make a safe crossing otherwise. Country Club Road is a recommended safe and scenic route in the official Lake Oswego Pathways Guide and highlighted as a route to travel safely by foot, bicycle, or inline skates. However, vehicles often travel very close or on the bicycle lane line and sometimes partially in the bike lanes. So pedestrians, runners, and cyclists often have to hug the edge of the shoulder of the road to avoid being hit. The sidewalk on the north side is very uneven with holes, obstacles that also can cause walkers and runners to shift suddenly to the bike lane. Also, as Mr. Hendricks mentioned, the vehicle speeds on Country Club Road often are above and sometimes well above the posted speed limit, making it even more hazardous for walkers, runners, and cyclists and vehicles to safely cross, enter, or exit Country Club Road. The intersection at Southwest Redwood Court is where there is Lake Oswego school bus stops, also TriMet bus stops, and would be an ideal place for a crosswalk with lighted flashing lights to allow for safe crossings that would really, I think, add to the protections of pedestrians especially. and also signal to drivers that this isn't just an uninhabited stretch of highway, but rather it is home to many residents of Lake Oswego. So a goal for Lake Oswego could be to transform Country Club Road into a welcoming parkway that encourages pedestrian and bicycle travel. Please make pedestrian and bicycle travel across and along this route truly inviting rather than a hazard that must be endured as a calculated risk to life and limb. And thanks very much for your time.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Ahrens. Commissioners, any questions for Mr. Ahrens? No? Thank you, and thanks to Mr. Hendricks for raising this issue. We appreciate your public comment tonight. Iris, is there anyone else who would like to make a public comment tonight?
That was it.
Okay, so we'll move on. This is the item number 5 on our agenda, Commission for Citizen Involvement, General Updates. I did have a few updates I wanted to provide. On April 21st, there'll be the Uplands Neighborhood Association General Membership Meeting. That'll be held from 4 to 5:30 p.m. It's a semi-annual Uplands residents meetings to discuss what's happening in the neighborhood. The guest speakers will be Eric Olson, the senior planner who's with us tonight. We'll talk about House Bill 2001. And then Mary Carey Larson, the Yellow Schools Communications Director, will also be there. So I encourage all members of the Uplands Neighborhood Association to attend their general membership meeting to be held on Thursday, April 21st, 2022 from 4 to 5:30 p.m. If you'd like a Zoom invitation, you may contact Bob Irvin at bobandmignon, that's BOBANDMIGNON at comcast.net. Next, we received another update from the Glen Morey Neighborhood Association that there'll be the 2022 Glen Morey Neighborhood Ivy Pole and Cleanup. This will be held from 2 to 4 p.m. Sunday, May 1st, rain or shine. They've requested dumpsters, and there'll be a neighborhood gathering at 16795 Old River Road following the event. They also make mention that if not everybody's interested in pulling ivy, there's no worries, just come to say hi and meet your neighbors. If you're looking for more information, you can visit the Glen Morey website. That's www.glenmorey.wordpress.com, and there'll be more final details on the Glen Morey website. I think that was it for the Commission for Citizen Involvement General Updates. I don't believe commissioners, there's any commissioners who want to give any citizen involvement updates. No? So we'll move on then to item 6 on our agenda. This is findings, conclusions, and order. This is item 6.1, the Community Development Code Amendment to Table 50.04.002-1, Special Street Setback, LU 22-0004. Public comments are not accepted. Staff, is there any opening remarks staff would like to make?
No, thank you, Chair. The proposed findings ought to reflect the Planning Commission's tentative decision, and as you may recall, there was no public testimony on that item, so the findings reflect the findings in the staff report.
Thank you. Commissioners, comments? Changes requests? Commissioners, is there a motion to approve and recommend the findings, conclusions, and order for LU 22-0004?
I'd like to make a motion to approve LU 22-004 or 0004.
I second.
Commissioner Buchanan made a motion to approve the findings, conclusions, and order for LU 22-0004. Commissioner Leek seconded the motion. All those in favor? Aye.
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 Any nays?
Chair Heap, for the record, I was not at the meeting. However, I reviewed the video of the proceedings, and I approve the motion.
Thank you. So I didn't hear any nays. Is there any abstains? No abstains. So the motion is passed to approve the findings, conclusions, and order for LU 22-0004 6-0. Thank you. Next, we'll move on to item number 7 on the agenda. This is a community development code amendments related to middle housing, LU 22-0007. Public testimony is accepted. This is a request from the City of Lake Oswego to amend LOC Chapter 50 of the Community Development Code to comply with Oregon House Bill 2001 from 2019. The state legislation requiring that cities allow middle housing, including duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters in areas that permit detached single-family dwellings. The staff coordinator is Eric Olson, senior planner. Attorney Boone, is there any comments that you'd like to make before
I'll
we
just
begin?
review the hearing procedure for everyone. This is a legislative decision, which is generally a policy decision within the discretion of the City Council. The Planning Commission will review the legislative proposal and make a recommendation to the City Council. Although a legislative decision may be discretionary, it must also comply with any applicable state law, as well as the statewide planning, any applicable statewide planning goal or administrative rule adopted pursuant to ORS Chapter 197. A legislative amendment to the Community Development Code must also comply with the applicable provisions of the Lake Oswego Comprehensive Plan. The public hearing process will begin with a presentation by staff, then testimony will be received from the public. Individuals will be allowed up to 5 minutes. Recognized neighborhood associations, homeowner associations, government agencies, or other incorporated public interest organizations will be allowed up to 10 minutes. The time limits do not include time taken by questions from the commission or responses to those questions. Testimony by attorneys, representatives, and witnesses on behalf of which are part of the presentation by a person will be counted within that person's time limit. Any person in attendance may cede his or her time for testimony to another person, but in no case shall any person's testimony be increased to greater than 10 minutes. At this point, I would ask the commission members to please declare if you have any financial conflicts of interest. Commissioner Week? Buchanan?
None.
I have no financial conflicts of interest.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart?
None.
Phillips?
None.
And Rigby? Commissioner Rigby?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Commissioner Rigby.
Do you have any financial conflicts of interest to declare?
I do not have any.
All right, thank you. Senior Planner Eric Olson with the staff report.
Testing. All right. All right. Thank you, Deputy City Attorney Boone, and good evening, commissioners. I'm here today to talk about the middle housing code amendments proposed by staff for compliance with House Bill 2001. This is consistent with the City Council goal to conserve the community's quality of life by planning for growth and change, and their initiative to adopt codes that comply with House Bill 2001 that are consistent with the community's sense of place, neighborhood character, and livability. So we've now developed some draft code amendments to comply with House Bill 2001 based on direction from both the City Council and Planning Commission throughout the course of several years. So we're here to talk about how that translated into proposed code and answer any questions prior to testimony. All right, so here's an outline of the topics I'll be touching on today. I'll do my best to highlight any items that we haven't spent too much time discussing in previous work sessions. So I'll start with a description of the process that we use to develop our recommendations. So we've talked a lot about middle housing with the Planning Commission over the course of the last several years. This all started in late 2019 when City Council directed staff to monitor the state's rulemaking process related to middle housing in House Bill 2001. This resulted in monthly written and oral reports to the Planning Commission on key issues related to the bill throughout the course of a year. Then, once the The state adopted their requirements known as Division 46 that kind of provide a roadmap for local governments to comply with House Bill 2001. We sort of started getting to work. Once we understood those rules, we were able to bring on consultants with Cascadia partners through a grant from DLCD, and we actually have representatives from Cascadia here with us virtually today to answer questions if needed. So with Cascadia's help, we conducted extensive research and analysis of neighborhood conditions and patterns, and we're really hoping to better understand this existing city fabric through both quantitative and qualitative analysis. So this included interviews with representatives from 17 different neighborhood associations, as well as a widely distributed neighborhood character survey that received about 880 responses. Cascadia also conducted an audit of our community development code to determine what specifically needed to be amended for compliance with the bill. Those various work products and findings informed the development of alternative implementation options that we've outlined in the Middle Housing Opportunities Report. This was produced a little over a year ago. We presented those findings and alternatives last May at a joint meeting of the City Council and Planning Commission, and discussed them in further detail at additional meetings thereafter. So that brings us to phase 2. So that was just phase 1, and now I'll talk a little bit about phase 2. So in early summer 2021, City Council appointed an ad hoc Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee to provide recommendations on code concepts for compliance with House Bill 2001 that would maintain the city's sense of place, neighborhood character, and livability. That committee was comprised of a balanced membership of 13 voting members representing a diverse set of interests. That did include Commissioner Leek from the Planning Commission. The MHCAC conducted 6 meetings between July and October of last year, and the recommendations that resulted from that work are outlined in a document that we refer to as the MHCAC Key Issues and Summary Memo. They developed recommendations on a variety of topics related to preservation of existing residential structures, scale and character of new middle housing, runoff and stormwater impacts of middle housing, and the affordability and accessibility of middle housing. So at that point, we received direction from Council to essentially prepare code amendments to move forward the recommendations that we received from the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee that were really required to be adopted by the state's deadline of June 30th, 2022. So that's really what we focused on. There's some other recommendations that resulted from that process that I'll touch on as well that aren't within the scope of the current code amendments. So that brings us up to late last year when we hosted the first of 2 virtual community forums to provide information on the city's approach to middle housing and to allow for public input before drafting recommended code changes. So that included launching an accompanying story map and survey that were available for about 3 weeks to the public. Most recently, we held 4 work sessions at the Planning Commission to discuss remaining policy questions related to the proposed code amendments that we needed to look at for compliance with House Bill 2001 and to receive more specific direction there. The recommendations that we developed with the direction of the Planning Commission were then presented to City Council on February 15th. So we have now, as I mentioned a moment ago, finally been able to draft a set of code amendments for public review. Those were released on March 7th. So those have been out there for a while. We've actually also put forward a supplemental staff memo that outlines a few modifications to the proposed code amendments that are suggested by staff. I would also mention that we hosted the second community forum on March 22nd in order to allow for more public consideration and discussion of the proposed code amendments prior to the public hearing. And that brings us up to speed with where we're at currently, which is the Planning Commission public hearing, of course. We have more public hearings to come at City Council as well, scheduled for May. So that's a mouthful, but I really wanted to focus on the long and intensive process that we use to develop these recommendations. All right, and so I will now get into the proposed code amendments themselves. So we proposed a number of changes to the definition section of the code for a variety of reasons. We added middle housing as a term. We defined that to align with the Division 46 definition. We separated triplexes, quadplexes, and other middle housing from multifamily, which is also defined in the code, really to specify that multifamily will now be separate from middle housing. Multifamily used to be defined as as little as 3 units in a single dwelling. So we had to make sure that they were different entities within the code. We modified the duplex definition a bit to align with Division 46. We added a few definitions related to cottage clusters, including new definitions for cottage cluster dwelling, common courtyard, and cottage cluster footprint, just to make sure that we were more directly aligned with the state requirements. We also added definitions for townhouse and townhouse project, just to try to be consistent. We also did our best to sort of clean up other terminology in the code. They used to call townhouses by a variety of different names, including zero lot line dwelling and attached townhouse dwelling. So we tried to just specify townhouse in as many instances as appropriate. So we really didn't have much discretion with these amendments, but this is kind of just a quick overview of what we did propose, a lot of cleanup, at least within the existing code, to go along with some of these requirements.
Rick, can maybe ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
We did receive a lot of input on cottage clusters and the definition. Will you be describing in this presentation on the definition change, and should we hold off, or would it be okay to ask questions now?
In terms of the definition, I will talk about the sort of minimum maximum, but I will talk a lot about the dimensional and design standards for cottage clusters and some of the recommendations that we made there.
Okay, so maybe we'll hold off on the questions until you get to that section. Thank you.
I will go into detail
Right,
on that, definitely. All right, so again, just in a general sense, we had to make sure that middle housing would be allowed in all of the residential zones where it would be required to be allowed under Division 46. So those included a number of low, medium, and high density residential zones, essentially all residential zones within the city. There are at least most zones with an R in front of them that aren't mixed use were modified here. So you can see those on the screen. I won't list them out, but you can see sort of where those can be found in the city in green on that map. We also updated the purpose statements to include middle housing. There's a lot of references to detached single family that were no longer relevant that we removed as well. So technically, because there will no longer be quote unquote single family zones in the city, we just wanted to change that for clarity. And I'll touch briefly on covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Of course, you see the map on the previous slide showing in green all the different areas where this could apply. This will be modified by covenants, conditions, and restrictions that sort of exist outside of the city's zoning code. So essentially, the way that this works for House Bill 2001, just to remind you, is that any covenants, conditions, or restrictions adopted prior to January 1st, 2020 will remain enforceable. And so this includes provisions that might preclude the development of middle housing within a given area. So those could be just private agreements on an individual property, but they could also be homeowners association related or implemented in tandem with a planned development or something of that nature. So they correspond highly with homeowners associations, but they're not only related to homeowners associations. Generally speaking, though, there's no, there couldn't be any new CC&Rs that would prevent middle housing from being developed, but anything prior to 2020 would still be enforceable.
Rick, if we may interrupt, Commissioner Phillips has a question.
Maybe I should already know this. Sorry, I got some blowback going here. Maybe I should already know this, but what's magic about January 1, 2020?
The code the legislation was adopted in 2019, so they had to set a date.
What's an arbitrary date?
I mean, it was tried to be as soon as as close to the adoption of the bill as possible.
I'm not arguing about it. I just wanted to know where it came from.
Yeah, I think it's relatively arbitrary, but it is trying to be somewhat close to when it was
It is the
passed.
date under which the statute said that once the statute became effective, it prohibited persons from that date forward, persons, HOAs, covenants, et cetera, from adopting covenants. So that's the effective date of the statute that prohibits it.
Right, so.
And when we say enforceable, that means privately enforceable. That's not a.
Yes, I will be, these are private agreements that the city is not a party to. So when they're enforceable, they wouldn't be enforceable through a city mechanism. So, just to touch on some of the changes we had to do to the use table, as I mentioned before, Division 46, of course, requires that middle housing types be allowed in most, if not all, residential zones within the city. You can see that this, in the code amendments, required an extensive update to the use tables to permit all the middle housing types in the zones where they are required. And so the table on the side just kind of shows you roughly what that looks like in terms of where we complied before and where we had to modify the code to ensure that we comply. In terms of the locations where middle housing can be constructed, that was a little bit more of a detailed discussion that we had. When it comes to the Division 46 requirements, the parameters are pretty strict when it comes to duplexes. Generally speaking, duplexes need to be allowed in every single lot where a single family dwelling would be permitted. So generally speaking, we would have to, in order to comply with Division 46, allow for duplex construction on non-conforming lots, just as we would for single family. When it comes to things that aren't duplexes, other middle housing types, they would still have to meet underlying siding standards, including minimum lot size, lot width, and building setbacks. So just wanted to clarify how it works for duplexes. When it comes to triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters, there was flexibility within the state's minimum requirements to allow the city to require larger lots than what we would require for single-family houses. So essentially, the largest lot rather that we could ask for a triplex is 6,000 square foot, and for quadplex and cottage clusters, it's 7,000 square feet. So generally speaking, you could see in an R10 district, any lot that meets minimum lot size is going to be 10,000 square feet, and thus over that 7,000 square foot threshold. So generally speaking, all these higher middle housing types would be allowed in R75, R10, and R15. But when it comes to other types of districts that have smaller minimum lot size, this would be more impactful, and it would again require a larger lot within the R3, RW, RDD, R5, and R6 districts, depending on the middle housing type. When it comes to density, Division 46 really prohibited cities from applying any maximum density standards to duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters. So we had to exempt middle housing other than townhouses from maximum density provisions in order to comply. So that would, really, I think that applies mostly to middle housing types other than townhouses in the R15, R10, R75, R5, RDD, RW, and R3 zones. So for townhouses, we specified that the maximum density is essentially 4 times the density that is allowed for single-family dwellings in a given zone. It could also be 25 units per acre, whatever's less. We also proposed to further specify that the density of townhouses may be no more than 4 units per attached townhouse structure. That's something that we mentioned in that supplemental staff memo that we understand now after some discussions with DLCD. We had to be a little more specific on that language. There's also a requirement that we allow for a minimum density of 4 units per acre for cottage clusters. So those had to be increased in the R75, R10, and R15 zones in order to comply. We also, again, to comply with Division 46, had to remove density limitations that applied on a per dwelling basis. So you can see that in the dimensional tables in the proposed code amendments that we removed those types of restrictions.
Eric, one question, just a point of clarification on the cottage clusters. The units are assumed to be detached housing units, is that correct?
Yes, by definition, they would have to be detached cottages, yeah. Right, so when it comes to review procedures, Division 46 required that middle housing is subject to the same review process as detached single-family dwellings in the same zone. So the development of a single triplex, quadplex, townhouse project, or cottage cluster, we propose for those to become ministerial decisions in order to comply with the bill, similar to a single-family development, which is considered a ministerial decision. So that existing ministerial process will apply to those types of middle housing. Again, the triplex, quadplex, townhouse project, and cottage clusters. However, when it comes to townhouses, because just the nature of a townhouse is that it's an individual unit located on its own lot, they almost always require a lot division or land division. That would still be considered a minor development, so it would be essentially, unless you had already done some type of land division, you'd have to go through a minor development process for a townhouse regardless. The design review component would no longer be required, however. And so another sort of complication here is that in the RDD zone, which is in the Old Town Design Overlay District, all development, as it is today, including single-family and middle housing dwellings, would be subject to minor development review. So we're not really proposing to change that, but middle housing will be allowed under the same sort of process that we would allow for single-family there. When it comes to variances, again, we have to use the same review processes that we would for single-family for middle housing, so we had to tweak those a bit, to make sure that they applied equally to single-family and middle housing. And any variance, though, would still require minor development review in that process. All right, so moving on to conversions and additions. Any middle housing created through the conversion of a single-family dwelling would be exempted or must be exempted from building design standards pursuant to Division 46. However, design standards could be applied to any newly added or replaced portions of the structure, which is important to understand as well. So we do have language in our proposed amendments that clarifies that. We did make some minor tweaks to this language as well in the supplemental staff report, where we just kind of tried to simplify the language here. The code amendments would also ensure that we treat middle housing similarly to single-family dwellings for the purpose of non-conforming development as well. All right, and this is getting into the dimensional standards. There's a lot to cover here, but I would just start by saying that generally we receive direction from both Council and the Planning Commission to apply existing bulk and massing standards, which we call dimensional standards in our code, to single-family housing, or that exists for single-family housing today. We could receive direction to apply that to duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouse projects. So generally speaking, you can see what that entails on the slide here. We're talking about standards such as minimum setbacks, maximum floor area, maximum lot coverage, maximum height, in both both front and side yard setback planes. So you can see on the slide there's a graphic showing how the city's existing dimensional standards would be applied to a quadplex, for instance. It would have to fit within the same building envelope under zoning as required for single-family dwellings. So here's a graphic that you can kind of see what this would look like for other types of middle housing on the same lot, just to give you a sense of kind of what this would look like. You'd have the same general bulk and massing for these types of middle housing as you would for a single-family house. But you would have, of course, more dwelling units than you would for a single-family house there. So, I think it's also important to point out here that we're proposing to apply the dimensional standards to a townhouse project. So typically, you can see single lot configurations here for everything but the townhouse project, which is 1 unit per lot. And because of the way we've defined townhouse project in the code, we're actually able to apply the same standards on a parent lot, if you will, same sort of setbacks, setback planes, lot coverage, floor area, et cetera, to the townhouse project. And that allows us to treat it essentially the same and sort of allow for those shared side lot dwellings there, the sort of attached side yards. So we tweak the standards appropriately to allow for those as well. And so this is another graphic just to clarify how setbacks, height, and setback plane standards would be applied to a building. You can see there's front, rear, and side yard setbacks, maximum height, and setback planes, which you can see sort of gestured at in those the sort of dashed lines there. I would also point out that height exceptions are allowed in certain instances for buildings when they provide wider setbacks, and that different setback standards also apply to steeply sloped lots. So we had some allowances for those for single-family housing that we had to extend to middle housing as well to comply with the bill. And this is just another look at kind of how lot coverage and floor area would contribute to, ensure that, if you're going to build and compliant to code, you likely wouldn't be able to build to the full lot coverage on the site, given these additional sort of parameters, or I'm sorry, you wouldn't be able to build to the full setback sort of envelope due to lot coverage and floor area. So this just kind of illustrates how that works. All right, so moving on to design standards. Generally speaking, we received direction to apply this existing design standards for single-family housing to duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses. Those include standards like the side yard appearance and screening standard, long wall plane standard, solar access standards, circulation, street connectivity, transit, a lot of different things that we apply for single-family developments. They also include design standards that are specific within neighborhood overlays, as well as certain zones that have their own standards, like the R6 zone in the first edition. So essentially, beyond just applying the existing standards to single-family or for single-family housing to middle housing, we're also proposing to enhance them a bit, go a little bit beyond those minimum compliance standards to ensure that the garages essentially aren't going to be too big or large or visually prominent with middle housing. So we thought that with more parking required for middle housing, there could also be likelihood for larger, more visually prominent garages. So we received direction to focus a little bit more on how to make garages less visually prominent. I would also point out that that was a huge concern that we heard during some of our outreach work with the neighborhoods, and particularly the neighborhood character survey, that the least desirable physical trait that folks had identified were large or visually prominent garages. So that was a huge concern amongst the neighborhood. All right, so in terms of some of the improvements that we proposed to the driveway and garage standards, for the most part, we're proposing to apply the existing driveway standards for single-family dwelling to duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. And that means that on lots with less than 75 feet of frontage, only one driveway would be allowed for both single-family and middle housing developments. So the intent is to maintain consistency with single-family housing, sort of the rhythm of driveways that exist currently within neighborhoods. It would be, a single driveway would be required to be shared by all residents to access their parking space or garage stall for middle housing. However, two driveways could be permitted on lots that have more than 75 feet of frontage under the standard. We think that this would result in more widely spaced driveways, which would reduce paving, grading, and tree removal. It would also reduce the number of access points to the street and encourage more of the front yard to remain unpaved and landscaped to not have a driveway surface. So under the existing code, we would allow for one driveway per lot for townhouses, and we're proposing to also do that under our proposed code amendments, but we did think of a few modifications as well to mitigate some of the potential negative impacts of townhouses. So we noticed that, you could really, with one driveway per lot, still result in a lot of paved surface in front of these structures. So we proposed to sort of limit the width of those driveways on smaller townhouse lots to reduce that excess paving, and we propose a standard that would ensure that the driveways are no wider than their associated garage opening. All right, and so I'll get into the garage standards a bit here. Much of the commission's input on design standards, as I mentioned earlier, was really related to garage appearance and location. These standards regulate how garages are integrated with single-family housing and duplexes currently. Sort of keeping with the theme, we're proposing to apply the existing garage appearance location standards for single-family to all middle housing, but we've also proposed a number of modifications to those standards that would apply to both single-family and middle housing dwelling types. These include required garage recessing for essentially wider garages that occupy more than 30% of the width of the facade. We have also decided to allow exceptions to increase the width of the garage to 75% only for lots that are narrower than 50 feet. The commission directed staff to essentially allow that exception because it would allow us to apply garage design standards to those narrow lots for the first time. So essentially, we're allowing for 75% of the width of the facade to be occupied by a garage, but it's really referring to a townhouse structure where it would be infeasible to construct a garage otherwise. So in order to apply garage standards to these smaller, more narrow lots, we had to modify them accordingly for this particular type of instance. We also propose to essentially scale the design standards to apply differently based on the width of the garage relative to the facade. So you can see here that we would require a deeper setback for a wider garage, as well as more garage appearance standards to be included along with that garage to mitigate the width. Again, that's based on a percentage of the facade. So that's probably the biggest sort of move that we've made within the garage appearance and location standards. This is a new concept. When it comes to those garage appearance standards, the sort of, you can see minimum number of garage appearance standards, 2, 3, 4. That's referring to these garage treatments, design treatments. So you can kind of choose from this list. And depending on the width of your garage, you'd have to provide either 2, 3, or 4 design treatments, such as either providing individual garage doors for each parking stall, separate garage openings that are offset by at least 2 feet horizontally. You could provide windows on each garage door, a decorative trellis, pergola, or other feature. You could provide a covered porch or a patio. And so those are different options that we would allow in order for these garages to comply with the requirement. And moving on to cottage clusters, as I promised Chair Heap earlier, given the direction from council and the nature of the Division 46 rules, there really isn't a ton of discretion for the modification of siting standards for cottage cluster housing. So our proposal is to adopt the standards of the DLCD model code that apply to cottage cluster housing. It's a bit different when it comes to the minimum compliance tract for cottage clusters. The minimum compliance tract will allow the cities to adopt the cottage cluster dimensional standards from the model code or a less restricted version of those standards. So it directly references the model code as opposed to Division 46 in this case. Division 46 does allow some flexibility for the city to define the minimum number of dwellings in a cottage cluster. Based on previous discussions with the commission and city council, we've recommended requiring a minimum of 5 units per cottage cluster. This is intended to sort of differentiate the requirements for cottage clusters from other forms of detached middle housing. It's consistent with council direction not to permit detached quadplexes, avoids confusion with any potential future allowances of detached quadplexes, and prioritizes neighborhood character by effectively requiring larger sites for cottage clusters. So on the other side of that, we have a maximum of 8 cottages per cottage cluster that we've proposed here. And this is something that we received a bit of, or we had a little bit more of a discussion with DLCD and came to the understanding that in order to comply with Division 46, we could set a maximum of 8 cottages around a single common courtyard, but not a maximum number of cottages per cottage cluster development, if that makes sense. So there is a maximum of 8 cottages per courtyard, just to be clear there. And sort of adding to that, some of these standards from the model code include that the maximum building footprint would be no more than 900 square feet. Cottage clusters are required to be exempt from lot coverage standards because they have that sort of footprint allowance and the sort of other standards intended to mitigate similar sort of, or to address similar concerns. Generally speaking, there's 10-foot setbacks on all sides for cottage clusters. That's a big difference from the general single-family dwelling envelope. There's also 10-foot minimum separation required between buildings. Parking lots have to be screened from view from the street, and common courtyards have to be landscaped and have common walkways as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about the model code standards here. So when it comes to the courtyard design itself, these are some of the standards illustrated for you. A minimum of 50% of the cottages would have to be oriented towards the courtyard. They'd have to be within 10 feet of the courtyard, connected to the courtyard by a pedestrian path. And they'd have to abut the courtyard on at least 2 sides of that courtyard, and it would have to be at least 15 feet wide at its minimum width, or its most narrow width. I'll touch a little bit about the parking design standards too. I just wanted to include this because they, I mean, it's important to understand, but it's another sort of big component of how a cottage cluster would need to be laid out that could impact, what you could really fit on the site, I think, to a degree. Parking is allowed in clusters of up to 5 spaces, so we've actually gone further with our supplemental staff memo and specified that they would have to be provided in clusters of up to 5 spaces. So we got clarification that that's a must, not a may, be allowed in clusters. They would have to be separated by about 4 feet of landscaping, those different parking clusters. They wouldn't be able to be located within 10 feet from a property line. They would need to be screened, and they would not, or they have different standards for garages and carports. They're not allowed to abut courtyards that are used for the common courtyard requirement for a cottage cluster. And garage doors would have to be limited to 20 feet in width for cottage cluster dwellings. I would just then touch on some more areas where we did have some flexibility within the Division 46 requirements to adopt standards that are a little bit more oriented towards the specifics of Lake Oswego. And one of the areas where we had some flexibility was to determine the maximum floor area requirement for individual cottages within a cluster. We did have flexibility to apply a maximum floor area for each individual cottage, but not for a development on the whole. So what we've discussed with the Planning Commission previously and with City Council was attempting to reach a maximum square footage standard or floor area standard for cottages within a cottage cluster that would replicate to the fullest extent possible the floor area that we would allow for a single family dwelling. So we went through some analysis with this. We included some tables when we discussed this at the Planning Commission previously and received direction essentially to allow for a maximum average size per cottage cluster of 1,000 square feet in most zoning districts, basically R7 on down, R7, R6, R5, RDD, R3, R2, R0, and RW. And just in R10 and R15, we would propose a 1,200 square foot maximum size for floor area within a cottage cluster, an individual cottage cluster. So just to sort of expand on this a bit, this is intended not to say that every single cottage could not exceed either 1,000 square feet or 1,200 square feet, but for the average size of all of the cottages within the cluster to not exceed those amounts. So once you do an average, you're still stuck with that amount, but you can have an individual cottage be higher or lower than that amount, of course.
And that's the average footprint or the average square footage?
Thank you for the question. No, that is the average square footage, floor area. So the footprints can be no more than 900 square feet. But when it comes to floor area, we are allowed to set a maximum and a minimum. We've elected to propose a maximum for these areas.
Commissioner Phillips?
I got a question about the cottage clusters. It seems, I think it's the only one of these designs that has a common courtyard. So who controls the common courtyard? That is, the activities that can go on in the common courtyard. And I assume that the age groups of the people that live in these cottages, there's no limitation. You'll have retired couple, possibly. You'll have family with children. So my question, who controls it and what are the activities that will be allowed in there? I think answer to number 2 will be based on number 1.
Well, I can say for sure that the city does not control that. The activities that are allowed within the courtyard and the cottage cluster. Typically, they would be, there's different configurations that could be proposed there. Commonly, there would be common ownership of the space. This is a pretty yet to be tested model, so we don't have a ton of examples to draw from, but a lot of them have had common ownership of the common space, the courtyard areas, parking areas, et cetera, that is shared through an easement or something of that nature. So those agreements about how they're used and other restrictions would then be developed at the time that they sort of develop that easement. and sort of made their proposal on development.
Okay, my experience, I got extensive experience in homeowners associations, okay? And being president for a number of years, I can guarantee you, if you sound like what you're suggesting, I don't think it's been determined, is what I'm hearing, but the suggestion that you leave it to the residents to figure it out is going to lead to tremendous conflict.
Yes, but that's what homeowners associations are for. They would legislate this. The city and the state isn't going to tell you what you can and can't do in those open spaces that are owned by the homeowners.
No, I understand that, but my question, is it going to become a homeowners association?
It has to be. If there's common ground like this, it's going to
Could
be
be
a
something
homeowners.
like it, yeah.
If that's the answer, then that's perfectly legitimate answer. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to say. With the easements, there would have to be some type of agreement that would be, agreed upon by all of the owners within the lot, essentially. So they'd have to all sign on to that, and whether or not it's enforced, that would be the sort of law of the land.
That's a whole nother set of issues. That's when the Karens come out of the, and the other people that don't like the rules, okay?
Right,
That's
but,
a
I
whole
think-
nother set of issues.
Of course. I think I'd just point out, we have a lot of multifamily apartment complexes and other types of shared living arrangements where there's common space that's handled a variety of ways currently, so it would exist similarly to common space on a multifamily development.
Thank you. As usual, the staff has thought about this. They just haven't had time to figure out how to implement it yet. Okay.
Yeah, and I think we also don't have the ability as a city to control what happens in those spaces for the most part under the Division 46 rules. But, there's always nuance there. Does that answer your question, though, Commissioner Phillips?
Absolutely. There will be a solution. It's just not here.
Yeah, it's a private sector solution, most likely, or a private, agreement type of solution. And so, I'll just move on. I haven't touched on parking requirements. It's another one of these areas where we don't have really any discretion as a city to change this. The Division 46 requirement is 1 space per unit. We are not allowed to require any more for middle housing, and that's what we require currently for single-family and duplex dwellings. So of course, there's no cap on the number of spaces. Developments are allowed to provide as many parking spaces as they'd like, but they are required to provide at least 1 per unit. Those spaces don't have to be within a garage or carport, and it would essentially subject middle housing to the same parking dimension requirements that we would ask for single-family dwellings as well. So this is a piece that we haven't touched on too much. This is another piece where we don't have much discretion, when it comes to access lanes and flag lots. So access lanes currently permit housing to be built in areas that do not have a frontage on a public street. And we look at this as kind of an exception to the requirement that all lots have a frontage on a street. So you can see this was originally 1 parcel on the slide. It was developed into 2, and there's an access easement that we refer to as an access lane going through parcel 1 for access to parcel 2. So essentially, when it comes to these standards, we have to allow duplexes the same exceptions to street frontage requirements that we allow for single-family dwellings. So what that means is that duplexes must now be permitted on flag lots served by an access lane in order to comply with the state requirements. We also have to, or I guess this is a bit of background, we have a requirement that there be an on-lane parking space provided for all flag lots on the lane itself. So this requirement has sort of served as sort of an additional space in practice. It's been kind of on top of the base parking requirement. Under the Division 46 requirements, as we understand them, that would need to be counted towards the minimum parking requirements. So that's another change that we propose within the code. When it comes to neighborhood overlay districts, there are some other things that we've proposed that are specific to a few different areas. Generally, the design standards that you can find in the different overlay districts throughout the city would still be applicable to middle housing, in particular, everything but cottage clusters, because cottage clusters are kind of their own beast. Now, we have impervious surface limitations in a number of these overlay districts, including Lake Grove, Uplands, I believe Glenmore R15 as well. And those would still remain effective, for all middle housing types besides cottage clusters. And cottage clusters have their own sort of use-specific impervious surface standards that you can see in the amendments that apply impervious limitations to the common courtyard, but not the entire site. So that's just kind of a little bit of a hook when it comes to cottage clusters there. We also had to look at some of the standards in the overlay districts to ensure that they did not scale by the number of dwelling units, which is not allowed under Division 46. So something like a front entry standard has been interpreted to scale by the number of dwelling units because every dwelling has to have a door entry. So if we require something like a porch for every front door, that you're scaling by the number of dwelling units in that case. So we intended to modify the front entry design standards in the Old Town Neighborhood Design Overlay, RDD, and the R6 zone, which it's not an overlay district, but in some ways it kind of functions like one, to make sure that they did not scale by the number of dwelling units. I also would mention that in the supplemental staff memo, we did propose a few additional modifications to the front porch standards in the R6 zone, and I'm sure we'll have a little bit more discussion on that later in the evening. We also, when it comes to the R6 zone, have proposed to essentially extend the exemption from alley surfacing requirements that is currently provided for single-family dwellings to all different types of middle housing. And that's another change that we proposed in the supplemental staff memo that we provided last week. All right, I think this is the last slide of our proposed code amendments, at least. When it comes to sensitive lands, we had to comply with Division 46, and Division 46 says that we have to allow for duplex development within the Resource Protection District. So this is kind of going back to that original stipulation that essentially all, duplexes need to be allowed on all lots that allow for single-family dwellings currently. They have this sort of different language when it comes to other middle housing types that they have to be allowed in areas where detached single-family is allowed, but because it's so specific that duplexes essentially have to be allowed everywhere that single-family is allowed, this extends to duplexes as well within the RP district. So, the code currently allows for detached single-family development in those districts, and because we extend that allowance, we'll extend it to duplexes within those areas too, to comply. Triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters, because they're not, or if they're not already allowed within the zone, they would continue not to be allowed within an RP district. So those would be, we wouldn't need to, in order to comply with Division 46, allow those types of housing in sensitive lands. Duplexes are also required to be allowed on sites that are encumbered by an RP district, similar to how we would be required to allow for a single-family dwelling on those sites. Again, because we allow that for single-family dwellings, we have to allow it for duplexes. And density transfer provisions that would allow density to be transferred from an area that was dedicated as an RP district to another portion of a site would also need to be allowed for duplexes in addition to single-family dwellings. So essentially, we're trying to maintain the code as much as possible, but we will have to allow duplex development in the same way that we allow single-family detached within RP districts today. And that covers the proposed code amendments. I will finish with just a few slides here on other policies that aren't within the scope of what we're talking about now that are related. And then we can talk about questions unless you have questions for me prior to then. All right, I'll just keep going. All right, so when it comes to expedited middle housing land divisions, I just wanted to touch on it briefly. We did not include this in our proposed code amendments specifically. We've talked about this previously, that the city will need to, under Senate Bill 458, allow for expedited land divisions that facilitate middle housing. We've talked about some of the ins and outs of that, but for the most part, we will be doing that without having a reference within the code itself. The way that we currently handle expedited land divisions, not for middle housing, which it's a current process that we use today, is to essentially just reference the state provisions, the OARs from the state, and not to put it within the code itself. And we've received some direction to do that here as well, just to, I think the idea was that we didn't want to go above and beyond to sort of point out that this is an option for folks, but there will be, handouts and different ways to administer this that will be developed, where we'll just directly reference those state requirements instead of the Lake Oswego code itself. It sounds like Evan and Scott might want to weigh on this a bit.
Thank you, Eric and Chair Heap and Commissioners. I think one thing just to point out with the Senate Bill 458 is that I believe it does require that for any middle housing land division that is proposed, that it must be processed through this expedited land division procedure. So it's really prescribed by the state, and we currently administer the expedited land division procedures by applying the statute directly rather than incorporate it into our code. So that's the rationale here. Thanks.
And we have received confirmation from DLCD that that's acceptable. All right, we also discussed previously that we were intending to develop new clear and objective standards related to public improvement. We pointed out before that when you change the classification of certain types of housing from minor to ministerial development, that would also impact the requirements that the development provide public improvements intended to mitigate the impacts of that development. Just as a really quick review, when the city reviews single family or duplex dwelling proposals right now, we use that ministerial process, which does not require a formal land use decision. These applications are primarily managed by the buildings department and reviewed by a staff similar to any other building permit application. This includes extensive review from the planning department as well to ensure compliance with zoning standards, setbacks, lot coverage, floor area, height, etc. So there's currently, within our current practices, we don't have an opportunity for ministerial development for the city to require mitigations or offsetting public improvements. So, the current way things work are that all development, whether it's ministerial, minor, or major, is subject to systems development charges, or SDCs, and other fees designed to recompense for the development now using the broad public infrastructure of the city and to similarly broadly contribute to future public infrastructure needed in the community, including parks, streets, sanitary sewer, water, and storm drainage systems. So these fees are usually collected at the time of building permit application or issuance, and it's a bit different than the process that we use for minor development proposals, which allow the city to sort of impose conditions of approval to further mitigate specific impacts related to the proposal. That mitigation is generally based on legal principles and consideration of both policy and site-specific factors. Again, this is for minor development. And what we do then is, essentially make sure that the public improvements are roughly proportional to the anticipated impact of the development. So SDCs and other development fees are also applied to minor developments, not just ministerial. So what we're doing right now is essentially working to create a hybrid process, more or less, where we're developing a process to essentially develop public improvement requirements for ministerial applications because we don't necessarily have that built into the process today. So the engineering department and city attorney's office are working to sort of fine-tune those to make sure they're right-sized, if you will, and appropriate for the types of development. So, this is a fairly extensive process. It's something we want to make sure we get right, but it's something that we're working on right now and are intending to move forward as soon as possible. I will also touch on some other work that the city is doing related to demolitions. The city council is currently reviewing the demolition definition in the building code right now to better address significant structural removal. We also are looking at policies related to the continuation of nonconforming development currently as well. These are concerns that came out of the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee process that we did not receive direction to address along with the other required code amendments by June 30th, 2022, but are nonetheless on our radar and we're working on an ongoing basis right now. And lastly, but not least, I think we've heard, this is another big issue that came out of the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee, was that, when the intent of this bill is really to produce housing that's more affordable to families, but some folks are concerned that that won't happen here in Lake Oswego without subsidies or assistance. So we did at least have a recommendation from the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee to look at different ways to incentivize the development of subsidized affordable units or accessible units that go beyond ADA requirements. We were told to sort of hold off on that. Again, we're not proposing that as a part of this package, but we will be exploring that in a lot more detail in the coming years with our work to update our housing needs analysis next year and to produce a housing production strategy and meet House Bill 2003 requirements by 2024. So we're hoping to comply with House Bill 2001 now, but that doesn't mean that we're out of the sort of, that we're done with our House bills. We still have House Bill 2003 to comply with and a lot of other things to talk about in the coming years. So it's a bit of a milestone, but it's certainly not the end-all be-all, these proposed code amendments. And that is officially the end of my presentation. So thank you for your time, and I will stop talking and let somebody else listen to their voice.
Thank you. Commissioners, questions for staff? Commissioner Rigby?
Thank you very much. Do you have any further kind of details or kind of rough schema for what you were talking about with the porting over of infrastructure development to mitigate the impacts of development into ministerial decisions? Considering that, if I understand it correctly, ministerial decisions are a pretty kind of a go down the list checkbox sort of process. How would those requirements potentially be factored into that process?
Thank you, Commissioner Rigby, for the question. We are starting to think about that, but I will hand this over to Deputy City Attorney Boone, who's been working more intensively on that.
Well, it would be a checklist. It would, well, currently, when we look at a development, we look at the number of dwelling units that are available, or that are proposed, or at least to have the opportunity. We would look at the street frontage, you look at the vehicle trips that would be generated, that sort of thing. And from that, you then have the range of what are required to mitigate. What is the required pedestrian improvements? What's the required vehicle improvements that have? Sometimes there's stoplights, there's lighting at the end of the intersections, et cetera. Those are applied by the engineering department in applying the conditioning authority at this point for minor developments and major developments. So using that long history of our rules of thumb, we would then come up with clear and objective standards which a developer would comply with, or I suppose might seek a variance to those standards. And then when they seek a variance, then they're into minor development. We can talk about it. So we would come up, and those standards would be adopted by code, I think, and they would come back before the Planning Commission, and you're going to take testimony on it as to what should be required for different types of dwellings and what the impacts of vehicle trips are, et cetera.
So to the extent that there would be a difference from present practice, it would be that the city just has less sort of leeway on a case-by-case basis to impose the conditions that it would desire.
Yes, I mean, the conditioning, the ability to impose conditions under our current code applies to minor and major developments, not to ministerial, okay? So we look at a case by case when we're looking at minor development. We don't apply the mitigation requirements when we're looking at ministerial developments. And that typically is, works out okay, because when you're looking at creating a lot, that is a minor development process, partition process. And so the mitigation requirements are imposed at that time, not at the time of the building permit. But now when we're looking at some ministerial approval of both middle housing land divisions by ministerial development process, and when you're looking at triplexes, quadplexes, et cetera, that's the ministerial, and so you would look at in order to impose the mitigations for the larger intensity of development, you would impose it at the time when that dwelling is proposed. And I think one reaction might be to say, well, if you're going to create a lot, why don't you just impose the maximum amount of mitigation that could be required if they built to the full extent of density that would be permitted? Well, that might end up with a lot more infrastructure than you and the neighborhood want, because not every lot that gets created is going to go to the maximum density. And so you don't need a 4-lane road where the lots are actually going to be developed, with either single-family homes or duplexes, et cetera. So that's why we don't want to just, that's why we would impose it at the time of the building permit on the ministerial development, so you don't get too much infrastructure either.
Thank you.
Commissioners, are there any other questions? Eric, one more question going back to the cluster housing and some of the input that we received. So we talked a little bit about lot coverage. We talked about that the maximum size of the footprint was 900 feet. I think one of the questions that we received through email to the Plan Commission was, could we impose a minimum footprint? Has staff looked at that, and does staff feel like that requirement is a valid requirement that we could put in?
It's certainly something we have looked at. I would definitely not call it invalid by any means. It's something that the minimum compliance provisions specifically allow us to do, to set a minimum floor area per cottage. So certainly within the realm of discussion. I would say that in terms of our recommendation internally, we didn't see a reason to implement a minimum floor area rather for individual cluster. We did hear that there were concerns about being able to construct more accessible cottage clusters that would have more floor area located on the first floor, and that maybe having a sort of minimum floor area could contribute to that. But I would say that there's no way specifically under the Division 46 requirements that we can dictate more floor area be provided on the bottom or the first floor than on the top. So even if we did have let's say a minimum square footage per cottage of 800 square feet, you could still have sort of 2 400 square foot floors, and that might not be the most accessible outcome. So I'm not sure that the minimum floor area is the best way to accomplish that particular objective, but it's up for interpretation, certainly.
And just a point of clarification, in I believe the model code that they were suggesting, they referred to the footprint less than 900 square feet. And so I was thinking that was synonymous with lot coverage versus floor area.
That's right, yeah.
So it's actually lot coverage.
It's not technically lot coverage because it's not calculated site-wide, right? You're just looking at an individual cottage. But yeah, when it comes to the footprint, my understanding is that we don't have the ability to set a minimum footprint. We can set a maximum. But Jamin, I'm not sure. Can you verify that? Can we set a minimum cottage cluster footprint under Division 46? My recollection is no.
I'm actually looking at the rules right now, and I'm trying to decipher, because it's not a question that we have gotten before yet in my experience on these. So my read of it is no. I believe it's the maximum must that the rules allow for the city to apply a maximum building footprint. It's one of those items, though, that the state rules may be silent on whether a minimum is permitted. So I hesitate to say that it's would be allowed under the rules. We might need some clarification from the state before we could say that kind of conclusively.
That's fair enough. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it is interesting that they explicitly do say that you can set a minimum floor area for a cottage cluster, but they don't say that for a footprint. I just point that out.
Mm-hmm.
Chair Houston, Planner Olson, I do recall during the discussion on this with the Middle Housing Code Advisory Committee, and then when it came before the Planning Commission, not on footprint per se, but on the floor, on the floor area limits. And there was some discussion about accessibility and that a larger floor area allowance might better accommodate single floor living. And I know that that was considered, and the standards that ultimately the Planning Commission provided your guidance on, I think you were considering that. So I'm not passing judgment on the 1,000 square feet, 1,200 square feet, but I think that was something that was considered when you were looking at that accessibility.
Thank you, Director Siegel. I would like to just reference the public input that we received through email talked specifically about a 900 square feet per unit and talked about, again, a footprint, which, again, seems to match not so much the square footage floor area, but the actual footprint. So I think as we go through our public hearing tonight, we can get more details and get clarification from that input on, you know, what it was, just confirm what it was that the public was asking for. And then maybe if it is specifically footprint versus floor area, you know, for footprint, do you have that leeway to actually set a minimum? So treat that as an open, and I look forward to hearing more from the public tonight as they testify, maybe get better clarification. Commissioners, other questions? No, so I would like to then open it for public testimony. I'd like to open it up for public testimony. Attorney Boone, would you like to remind us of the time limits that apply?
5 minutes per individual, 10 minutes for recognized neighborhood associations, homeowner associations. Any person can cede his or her 5 minutes to another person, 10 minutes maximum. And just for clarification, you can't cede like 2 minutes of my time to that person. It's 5 minutes or nothing.
All right, thank you. Iris, could we please call the first person who would like to give public testimony tonight?
Carol Ockert.
Good evening, Ms. Ockert. Thank you for coming tonight, and please proceed.
Thanks. Iris is going to put a PowerPoint up. Iris, how do I advance the slides?
Oh, apologies.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Carol Ockert. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this evening as part of the public hearing on the draft code process for HB 2001. I'm the chair of the Neighborhood Chairs Committee. I participated as one of the 2 neighborhood association representatives on the Middle Housing Committee. And I'm also the land use liaison for the first edition Forest Hills Neighborhood Association. It is in that role that I am speaking tonight, representing the Fan Forest Hills Coordinating Committee. My board has followed this process closely with almost monthly updates over the last year, and we appreciate the work that you've done at Planning Commission, building on the input from the Middle Housing Committee, working with staff, and refining code concepts to get us to code compliance with HB 2001 in accordance with council direction. The Fan Forest Hills Coordinating Committee supports the draft code before you tonight, together with the revisions that have been made in the April 1st staff report. But there is one revision that still needs to be included regarding the covered front porch in the R6 zone before HB 2001 takes effect. And let me explain. R6 is a zone that is only in the first edition neighborhood. Code in that zone requires that the dwellings be built with a covered front porch. You can see in this photo that it is an iconic design component in our older home stock that we wanted to see continue in the streetscape of the neighborhood. It's neighbor connecting, it's neighbor friendly. Code was developed in the mid-90s that directed each new home have a covered front porch. But the code was not tight enough, and builders started to construct houses with the main entry on the side of the building. The covered front porch became a covered patio, here with a masonry fireplace facing the front sidewalk. It was undermining the intended code-directed streetscape. So in Planning Commission and the City Council in 2015 adopted more stringent code language that stipulated that the covered front porch had to be off the main entry, face the front of the lot, and include a path to the street. Now we must refine our code to remove the term main entry to be compliant with HB 2001. The April 1st revision complies with HB 2001 but still needs to provide a design standard protection to make sure the front porch retains the open look of a front porch. I have that language to show you, and I want to note covered patios complete with outdoor fireplaces would continue to be fine just along the long sides and rear of the buildings, but not the front. Staff understands and supports language to keep our covered front porch code intact. This follows council directive. And here in blue is language that I've brought forward from our board and want to put before you this evening. The covered front porch must be open and unobstructed, unobscured on the side of the porch that faces the narrow street frontage. A railing may be provided up to 3 feet in height as measured from the finished floor of the covered front porch or the state mandated railing height for that project, whichever is higher. And that language is because not all projects would mandate a front porch railing because some of them are on grade, but people might want them anyway. We want to provide them all of that maximum flexibility, or if the railing height changes per state building code, again, we want that to carry forward. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and hopefully this will be just an easy definitional design.
Well, Commissioner, questions for Ms. Ogre?
This is almost a question for Eric, too. As I was reading through the 175 pages of fascinating reading of, it talks about some of the proposed or the restrictions that some of the porches have to be entered on the long side of the lot if it's on a corner. So the front porch wouldn't be on the narrow side, it would be on the long side. It's one of the provisions in there.
Perhaps I could answer that. I actually did help write the code at the time, and so the entrances can be on the side, but the front porch has to be on the narrow side, even on that corner.
Now, this is the first edition codes.
Correct.
I'm talking about the ones that were in the House bill.
Oh,
Yeah, and I think that's something that we inadvertently allowed for when we updated the standard the way that we did. We didn't necessarily intend for the requirement to address porches on the wide street or avenue frontage, if you will. So I think we went back with the language and attempted to essentially rewrite the code such that those side porches could no longer count towards the requirement. Okay. But you could still provide them. It's just they wouldn't be the required front porch on the narrow street frontage.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that clears it up. I hope I didn't create more confusion with 175 pages of language to look through. But
okay, thank you.
Commissioners, any more questions? I don't see Commissioner Rigby. I don't know if he has a question or no. No? All right, thanks, Ms. Hooker.
Thank you.
Next, Iris. Nobody else would like to give testimony? Right. I guess I would like to kind of recognize the input that we got. So we did receive an email input from Shannon Clark, who expressed concern about the denser housing canopy and the tree canopy, the effects that it may have. So the commission received that, acknowledges, and thank you, Ms. Clark, for sending that in. We received input from Rockwell Mullen, who indicated that he's a third-generation Lake Oswegoan, and that he's concerned about the community experience and potentially the lower property values that the bill would have. So thank you for that input. Next, we received email testimony from Robert Irvin. His concern was with cluster housing, and as we were discussing earlier, mentioned that there was the draft code had a maximum footprint for 900 square foot, and asked for the commission to consider implementing a minimum footprint for individual cottages of 800 square foot. And again, that was for footprint. We received email written testimony from Alder Miller, who thanked the commission for the ability to provide the comments, and then talked about the same issue, that for footprint, and specifically what was mentioned was that this had come up from, I believe, the 50 plus committee and board in Lake Oswego, with the concern that there be sufficient space on the ground floor to meet the needs of people with ambulatory limitations. So again, this goes to the question that we were mentioning earlier of footprint versus floor area. You know, what do they really mean? And I think we can talk about that a little bit. Then I'd like to acknowledge the email written testimony that we got from Susan Labard, who expressed concern in opposition to the middle housing code amendments, and asking for the commission to carefully consider all of the code amendments that we're making. And I believe that was it for the written testimony. So I thank everybody who came tonight, and then I also thank everybody who provided the written testimony. Commissioners, any further comments on the testimony that we heard? I guess the one that I was particularly interested in was, you know, the input that we got for setting a minimum footprint, especially when it was mentioned in the context of ambulatory care or concerns. You know, for footprint, just setting the minimum of a, say, 800 square feet for a footprint, I didn't see how that would necessarily solve the issue of ambulatory care. It seemed like that was going more after ADA concerns, which staff mentioned we would be looking at when House Bill 2003 came up. I could perhaps see, if we're setting certain minimal square footage on the floor area, how that could, you know, impact people that had ambulatory needs. However, I did feel like, you know, the area of ADA compatibility, looking at issues with that was slightly outside of the scope for what we had for the minimal implementation of the model code. That I think there's a lot more work to be done as we come up with House Bill 2003. These are really important issues that we could consider, but you know, I think I would personally like to see staff, you know, get more input on this, to take a closer look at it and come back with recommendations, rather than saying, you know, tonight we would endorse and adopt a minimal square footage for footprint in the hopes that it would address it. I don't think the commission has really been prepared to see that, and I don't understand how it would necessarily address those concerns. So I think they're important concerns, but I'd like to, you know, have the Plan Commission and staff, you know, continue to work on that, and maybe that's will be addressed with House Bill 2003. Commissioner Leek, do you have a comment or question?
I didn't see that we had a minimum square footage or footprint. That's what you're saying.
Correct.
The difference between the footprint and the, help me here.
Yeah, so we received the email asking the commission to add a requirement for a minimal footprint of 800 feet, and it referenced the model code, which talked about a maximum footprint of 900 feet.
Right.
So, you know, the references that they were making to the model code was really with footprint on cottage clusters. It wasn't square foot area at all. So, and then the other email seemed to kind of follow on to the first one that talked about the Plan Commission asking for implementing a recommendation or for a requirement of footprint coverage, but then talked about the concern that from the 50+ committee that, you know, there was ambulatory people who had provided input to say
Right.
that if it had a larger footprint, it would actually meet and satisfy some of the needs of people that had ambulatory issues. So, like I said, I don't think that's within our scope for ADA right now, and I'm not sure that it was clear what they were asking.
If we set square footages of the R1 to R5 or whatever that grid was, of a maximum of 1,000 square feet, that's the maximum top, bottom, whether it's one level or two, and then in R10 and R15, we said 1,200 square feet, which is much more doable with more square footage on the first level. We have to keep that in mind. That we've already set in the most of our zones a maximum of 1,000 square feet
For floor area.
for floor area, top, bottom, or one level.
Correct. And I think, again, it's, to me, the issue that I have is I really appreciate the concern that's being raised for ADA and ambulatory concerns, but I think it goes bigger than just either setting the square area for floor area, square footage for floor area, or even if it was, you know, the footprint, the lot coverage for an individual cluster unit, that to address those ADA concerns or it's much more than that. It could be the size of the bedroom, it could be, you know, the rails, the shower. You know, I have family that have concerns like that. And most of the concerns that are discussed are not around, you know, square floor area, square footage for floor area.
Right, but you can't
It's grab
dictate that
bars,
to a
it seems like.
developer who's going to be building these. Is that what you're saying? You want to be able to dictate these things?
No, I'm saying that the suggestion that came before us tonight for the Plan Commission to add a requirement for setting the minimum either footprint or square footage for floor area, I don't think the commission's in a position to add that tonight.
Okay,
That my recommendation is that we do not do that. We don't add that requirement.
but you're okay with the square footage maximums that we set in these
Yes.
zoning areas?
Yes, absolutely,
Okay.
yes.
Okay,
I'm just saying
on
that it's
first?
a very, very noble. I really appreciate the community's concern in raising this issue. I just think it's slightly outside of the scope in the charter that we've been given for implementing the model,
but it could,
minimal
it
model
could
code.
be though. I mean, we've got the ability to put that input into it.
But again, I don't think it's necessarily a well-vetted solution in terms of just simple requirements for minimum, you know, especially to just address, again, ambulatory concerns. But to say if that's our goal is to address these ambulatory concerns, ADA concerns that's been raised, and we're going to simply solve it by specifying floor area or by specifying the footprint lot coverage for an individual unit, it's not going to solve it. It needs to be
But
looked at
doesn't the
deeper than
state,
that.
doesn't the state just give a maximum? They didn't have a minimum.
Correct. That's exactly
So
correct.
it's problem solved. The maximum you can have is according to what the state has, and we don't have to make a minimum.
Can I jump in here a second?
Sure, Commissioner
Weigh
Stewart.
in. I also appreciate the concerns in this email. I think the building code does a very good job of addressing issues of ADA and ambulatory care. And I think the issues that this person addresses, to me, are more about dimensional requirements. How wide is a doorway?
Yes.
You know, whether you need a roll-in shower versus a tub that you step into. So I don't think this is really a planning decision. The building code, when somebody will develop a a development like this, the building code will mandate that a certain percentage of these houses are what they call adaptable or even accessible. And so the developer will address that by inadvertently probably making the footprint of the first floor larger to accommodate those needs. So I don't think that's something we really need to address here. I think once it gets to the building permit level, it'll be taken care of.
Is that true that the building department would necessitate a certain percentage of them to be ADU compliant?
The building code requires on developments of multi-unit housing, whether it's cottage clusters, multifamily, townhouses, et cetera, they require a certain percentage of each unit to be accessible or adaptable depending on the size of the development. Yeah, that's been in place for years, so.
Thank you, Commissioner Stewart. I think you summarized that very well. It's similar to my thoughts. It's outside of the scope, and there's code that's outside of the Plan Commission's code, and specifically in the building code.
Yes, that's a short way of saying it, yes.
Yeah, addresses it. Yes, thank you. Iris, was there anyone that, again, that wished to make, no, Commissioner Rigby, you have a comment?
Just simply regarding what the commission was discussing, I think what seemed to be said by staff earlier also was that there is some question as to whether we would be able to set those kind of requirements that they're seeking. So I would agree that even if we wanted to move forward with something like that at this point, it would be necessary to wait for further guidance from the state on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Rigby. So again, I think we've heard from everybody that wished to make public testimony. So I would like to close the public testimony session and then just move into more discussion with the commission. The other question I'd like to ask the commission for feedback on was that we did hear from Ms. Okert tonight and had a suggestion on modifying the code with respect to the front porches. The commissioners have comments on that. Commissioner Stewart?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a reasonable request. I didn't have a chance to ask because I kept rereading it, trying to understand. I wasn't quite sure of the meaning. I don't know if we have the ability to put that statement back up on the screen, but I just wanted a clarification on something. And again, I apologize, I didn't ask this sooner.
This is my presentation. I think he wants Carol's presentation, actually, yeah.
Yes, the slide that had the actual proposed language on it.
And I can skip to it, hopefully.
I think so, but I actually just had a question about, it's literally a grammar question, just so I'm not misinterpreting it. Okay, thank you. So it says the covered front porch must be open and unobstructed, unobscured on the side of the porch that faces the narrow street frontage. I'm assuming you're referring to on the side of the house that faces the street frontage. Okay, thank you. That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page.
Sorry, I don't know if I can speak.
That's all I have.
I think they were just trying to clarify that it's the porch itself as opposed to the barrier between the porch and the home that would need to be unobstructed, basically.
Seems reasonable to me.
I guess the question would be, Eric, to you and to staff. Did staff have a chance to review this, and was there any feedback that staff has to the commission?
We haven't discussed the specific language, but I think the reason that we didn't include this in the supplemental staff memo is because it was seemingly to us a little bit beyond the scope of what we were tasked to do for middle housing. But considering that we are sort of going into these front porch standards within the R6 zone to modify them in such a way that they comply, it might be a good time to really directly address what was intended to be addressed back in 2015 related to that fireplace, sort of an obstructed front porch that creates an interruption in the sort of rhythm of the urban fabric there. So I'm certainly, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it does get to the original intent, and it might be a more direct way. But it wasn't necessarily the scope of what we were tasked with, so we didn't propose it ourselves.
And Eric, just as a point of clarification, the reason why we were looking at the front porch standards was, I believe, because Division 46 had concerns about limiting the ability to scale. Is that correct? And that these would potentially, some of these things that we had in our code would be viewed as limiting the ability to scale, correct?
Yeah, I think we couldn't require essentially a front porch for every single entrance because that would be scaling by the number of dwelling units. We also had language in the code that said at the main entry, there needs to be a covered front porch, which when you have 3 or 4 units, what becomes the main entry, so we had to try to simplify it so that it would be applicable to middle housing.
Thank you. And that was my concern, was just to make sure that it didn't appear to be the case, but I didn't know if staff had vetted this more, but these changes wouldn't be any way going against that desire to, prevent the ability to scale, that these would be acceptable modifications to our front porch code.
I don't see any reason that they wouldn't comply, that the language that Carol proposed wouldn't comply. But, we haven't had a ton of discussion internally on what the correct railing height or whatever it might be. But, I think generally speaking, conceptually, it's a solid idea.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Buchanan?
Thank you. The fireplace language I have questions about. So I know you want an unobstructed opening between the street and the front of the house. The fireplace shown in the image was between those two. However, if the fireplace is off to the side, is that acceptable? Or
Commissioner Buchanan, may interrupt here for just a point of order. I think if we're going to be asking Ms. Hoker direct questions, then can we call her back to the stand?
Okay.
To ask her so the public. Attorney Boone, is that acceptable in terms of process? Yes.
Thank you for that.
Ms. Hoker, if you don't mind, would you please come to the stand?
Hi, happy to answer any question I can.
Thank you. So just as stated.
So the code allows for as small as 50% of the front of the structure. And so the intent of the language is to say no, nothing at all on that front, not off to the side. Now, on the back or those sides, there's nothing stated about that at all. So someone could do anything on this side and this side or the back side, just not the front side.
Gotcha.
So again, this is truly to do the minimum possible to just keep that front open.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
Commissioners, any other questions? Commissioner Phillips?
Are we being asked to vote on this tonight?
Yeah, well, let me ask staff. Is there a direction that staff is asking from the commission? Should we go through and make a recommendation on the code that we've reviewed so far tonight and ask staff to go back and start approving findings based on the recommendations of these specific code aspects? Director Siegel?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Heap. And if the commission were prepared to, make a motion this evening for tentative approval or recommendation on the code package, and really the only outstanding issue that you've identified so far is the recommendation from Ms. Oker. So you may want to just take a straw poll on whether the commission is favorable on making that change. I think if you're supportive of that direction, then, then staff would review it for legal sufficiency and of course, reach out to Ms. Oker, and if we were considering recommending anything other than what was presented here, we would coordinate with her on that. But I think that's really the kind of the next steps would be to try to achieve consensus on that and any other modification that you might be considering, and then entertain a motion for tentative recommendation of approval.
Thank you, Director Siegel. So let's start then with asking the commission, this is more of just a straw poll, would you support the recommendation for the front of the R6 front porch changes that Ms. Okert came before us tonight and requested? Maybe I'll just call on the commissioners down the line. Commissioner Lee,
Yes.
Commissioner Buchanan,
Yes, I would.
I would support it. Commissioner Stewart,
I would, yes.
Commissioner Phillips,
Absolutely. I know an expert in porches when I hear, okay.
Commissioner Rigby.
I think it bears looking into, yes.
Okay. Yeah, and again, I assume the commission concurs with that, and generally, we recommend to staff to go back and look at the recommendation that Ms. Okert had brought before the commission tonight, and then again, vet it for full legal compliance, and then come back to us with an update. Then let's proceed. Are there any other changes that commissioners feel we'd like to make to the middle housing code package that was presented to us tonight by staff? Commissioner Stewart?
Yeah, I've got a few in here, but I'll just start with this one, and then maybe we can kind of move around. Since there's been a lot of talk about garages and garage openings and minimizing the effect of the appearance of a garage, I've seen a couple of statements in here about maximum garage door widths or something like that being 20 feet in width. I don't know that there actually is garage doors that wide. So if this is a minor detail, but if we want to truly minimize the appearance of garages, 16 feet is a typical two-car garage door size, so maybe we just say no more than 16 feet.
Commissioners, maybe can we get a point of clarification from staff, Eric? I thought it was more a percentage of the width of the front facade than it was a fixed size on the width of the door itself. Can you clarify?
Yeah, I think what Commissioner Stewart's referring to is the code for cottage clusters. So the garages within a cottage cluster would be limited to a maximum of 20 feet for the garage width, and that would not apply to other types of housing.
Yeah, well, let me jump in there because I don't want to make. I don't think we need to want to make garages smaller than 20 feet. I guess I thought I had read language that was talking about sizes of garage doors somewhere, and if that's not the case, then, pretend I didn't say anything. But anyway, that's what I had seen, and again, I apologize if that's not what it was actually saying. I really tried, but...
And I think it's openings. You could have a cottage cluster that it could have carports with 2 units sharing one opening, and they don't want that opening to be any more than 20 feet, whether it has a door or not.
Also, Commissioner Stewart, then you're okay with not recommending a change from what we heard tonight?
I'm okay, yes.
All right, thank you.
We don't want to make them so small that you can't actually put a car in them,
Commissioner Stewart, did you have a set of other changes that you wanted to go through?
I had a question. I guess I'll jump over. I had a question. Again, this is a clarification thing, and I read this many times, and I kept seeing the same thing. But let me see if I can find it now. So I'm on. Okay, so I'm on page 79 of 126 of the proposed code language document. And way down at the bottom, they talk about minimum garage offset from dwelling, and they've got point A and point B. And as I was reading point A and point B, they seem to be saying the same thing to me. So like for part A, for example, it says if the width of the garage is less than 30% of the width of the front facade of the dwelling, then the garage shall not be located closer to the street than the dwelling. So I'm wondering if that means if the width of the garage is more than 30% of the width.
if I may. So this is an interesting standard. This is actually a standard, if you look at it right now. So this does not refer to the garage opening. This is one of those weird standards in the code where it refers to a garage. It could be referring to the side of a garage with a side-loaded garage, such that essentially the way that this standard, which is based on our current code standards, basically, is to require like fenestration of some type on garages where the side of the garage, but not the garage opening, is facing a street. We have very complex code, so we have regulations for both the garages that face the street and for garages that don't face the street, and that's our interpretation is that this applies to garages that are side loading as well.
I guess then if you read Part B, though, it says if the width, so that's smaller than 30%. So then if you read Part B, it says if the width of the garage exceeds 30% of the width of the front facade of the building, then the garage must be set back further from the front lot line than the dwelling. Isn't that saying kind of the same thing? They're both talking about if this happens, then the garage needs to be set back from the face of the dwelling.
Right. I think the reason, let me just look into this really quick.
I mean, in general, I like the idea of setting garages back. I just want to make sure I understand what the.
I mean, essentially what it's doing is applying certain standards to garages that are less than 30%, but then kicking, essentially the purpose of B is to kick it to our new standards, to refer them, in this instance, when it's over 30% of the facade, to the scaled standards, if that makes sense, based on the width as a percent of the facade. So it might be a bit repetitive, but it's referencing other code later that is, applicable to those larger, wider garages.
Okay, I'll just have.
So it could be so. I guess the way that it reads right now is that essentially, if you have a really small garage, a really narrow garage. It has to be located, it has to be set back, but it doesn't say how much it has to be set back, essentially. And so B kicks it to a table that says it has to be set back a certain number depending on the width of the facade, more or less.
If it's over 30%, if it's
over,
if it's 30% or less, it just has to be in the same plane as any habitable space of the house.
It can't be closer, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It can't be any closer to the street than habitable space of the house. Whereas if it's over 30%, then it has to be back 2 feet. And if it's even bigger, then it has to be set back 4 feet. And that's been the code for new construction for a while. So it's to have no stub-nosed houses.
Yeah, and I have no issue with that. I was just again, grammatically, I was trying in my head to understand how they were different, right?
I get
why
it.
have both?
I would also point out, I misspoke earlier. There's another section of the code that's talking about for garages that don't face the street. So I apologize for that. So just a second. Yeah.
Non sequitur.
Yeah, sorry about that. But
All
yeah,
right, Chair, that's all I have. Thank you.
All right. Commissioners? Changes? I see no other questions or change requests. So is there a motion to recommend to staff for approval of the code presented tonight related to LU 22-0007 for amending LOC Chapter 50 to comply with Oregon House Bill 2001? And I'd also add to that the recommendation would be to accept Ms. Okert's R6 recommendation on front porches and have staff review that and come back with a more detailed proposal based on that. Commissioner Stewart?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I second.
Iris, would you please call the roll?
Buchanan,
Yes.
Heap,
Yes?
Leek,
Yes.
Phillips,
Yes.
Rigby,
Yes.
Stewart.
Yes.
Thank you. The motion's passed. It's approved.
All right, that's a tentative decision, and written findings will be brought back to the commission at our next meeting on April 25.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is other business. We did have one item. I sent an email out to all the commissioners, just letting them know that tonight we'd like to nominate a plan commission member for the Neighborhood Enhancement Grant Committee. So I wanted to ask commissioners if there's any nominations. Would anybody like to serve as the plan commission representative on the Neighborhood Enhancement Grant Committee? Commissioners?
I just want to make a statement. I was the one to serve on it most recently, and in terms of time commitment, it's pretty small. I think we just met once, right, in the time that I was on it. I don't, twice, okay.
Maybe
Would
in
you
the
like
time
to do
that
it
you were on.
again?
Yeah.
Would you
What's
like to
that?
do it again?
Well,
I would like to see if others are interested first, but
Yeah.
if not, I'd be happy to do it again.
And Chair Heap, I'm sorry to interrupt the process. And by the way, our grant program manager is Eric Olson, so if anyone has any questions about what the program entails, you can answer your questions about that. In terms of the process for appointing a representative, during the last round of grants, when the recommendations were brought before the City Council, who were very supportive of the grant committee's work and ultimately approved, the grants as I believe they're recommended. One piece of feedback the council provided was that the staff, and this is a staff-appointed work group, it's not a council-chartered committee, the feedback was that staff should seek volunteers broadly and primarily to have as many people be able to participate in this process as we can. And so as a result, the direction was to, with all respect and appreciation for our former committee members, to have new committee members appointed. So that's, I guess you're off the hook, Commissioner Stewart, but I just wanted to, because the other bodies that are contributing to this process, including representatives from the City Council and neighborhood associations, and then more recently, I believe the 50+ Advisory Committee, Youth Council, and there was one other.
The DEI Advisory Board, but
So
we don't have a confirmed rep from them.
They're
yet.
each contributing a representative from what I understand.
And just to follow on to Commissioner Stewart's statements, is I was just going to say, I think it's a really good opportunity. It's minimal time commitment, but there's a real opportunity here to meet with the neighborhoods, interact with some other key members of boards and commissions. So it's kind of a fun opportunity. I know a lot of times in the Plan Commission, like tonight, we're going through very detailed code, but these opportunities can sometimes be fun in that, you're doing new things, you're meeting members of the community and other boards and commissions. So it's kind of a fun opportunity, I believe. So with that, are there any nominations that we'd like to make?
I would like to nominate Mr. Buchanan to do it. I would only say that I would step up, except last summer I did 8 of the Middle Housing Advisory Committee meetings, which lasted at least 2 to 3 hours each. So I think I'll pass on this one.
Commissioner Buchanan, any comments? You don't have to accept it if you don't want. We're not putting you pressure, but
I'd like to respectfully decline.
I think, therefore, I would like to nominate Commissioner Phillips. Commissioner Phillips, would you be so honored to serve as our Neighborhood Enhancement Grant Plan Commission representative?
Sounds like I'm being nominated because I do the best whitewashing of fences, okay? So. Now, listen, this is no surprise. Commissioner Heap called me this afternoon and we had a long discussion about it. It sounds like something that I would be interested in. It's got a definitive time frame. And there's money involved, so it means that, there's people that are going to be very interested in making good proposals because they're going to have to do so to convince, I would assume. So, yes, I would be happy to do it, but I certainly do not want to step in the way of somebody that wants to do it. I'm doing it because it looks like an opportunity. But I will accept it, but again, if you really want to do it, please.
Well, I think we had established that it's a good idea to rotate it among us, so I think it's a good thing that you're doing it.
I'll do it.
All right. Yeah, let's take a motion to approve then. So I'd like to make a motion to approve Commissioner Phillips as our Plan Commission Neighborhood Enhancement Grant Committee liaison representing the Plan Commission. Is there a second?
I'll second.
I would like to second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Yay.
Abstain.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the motion's approved. Thank you, Commissioner Phillips, for serving as our Neighborhood Enhancement Grant Committee liaison. Director Siegel, is there anything else that we wanted to cover?
No other business
for
this
the business?
evening.
All right, and then we'll move on to next agenda item, is schedule review.
Thank you. Your next scheduled meeting is April 25th, and as you've decided tentatively, you're really the only agenda item for that evening are the findings, final decision on the middle housing code amendments. Your next meeting after that is May 9th, I believe, and tentatively we have a work session scheduled with the Lake Grove Business Association and the neighborhood associations that are working on code and policy changes for West Lake Grove and the Lake Grove Village Center. That's tentative. We need to confirm that with Mr. Sandblast. Then the next meeting after that would be the 23rd, I believe, and we have scheduled a tour of demolition / non-conforming development sites, and we're putting that together for the commission. Just wanted to check on your availability that afternoon, assuming that we would want to do that in daylight on the 23rd. And is everyone available for like a 2 p.m. start? Is that possible?
What day is?
What day is that?
Yeah, what day of the week is
Monday
that?
the 23rd.
Monday
The 23rd, yeah.
Week before Memorial Day.
Alternatively, you know, we could try to schedule a weekend tour, but we'll need to check with staff and it may be a little further out if we wait.
Monday, I think, would be good. Yeah.
Road trip.
Comments, feedback from the other commissioners, Monday, the 23rd?
It's 23rd of May, right?
Correct.
Yeah, it seems Director Siegel Commission could make that on May 23rd, Monday.
Okay, thank you.
Nothing else? Then the meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to all that came out and either gave written testimony or testified in person tonight on the middle housing bill. Really appreciate all that feedback and comments, and thanks to all the commissioners for all your hard work doing on the commission. Thank you and good night.